Now, the weird thing about text is, for a really long time, it was incredibly expensive to do. So only a few people did it. It was a broadcast technology. The priestly elite would write books, and the rest of us would read it. But the average person didn't really do much writing. This is almost kind of a hard thing to recall now, because we have incredibly cheap ways to write down our thoughts. But for a long time, paper was insanely expensive, and even pens were insanely expensive. Here's a marker of how hard it was to get your hands on paper. This is George Washington's, one of his adjutants. In the Revolutionary War, he wrote a letter when he ended saying, "Excuse these scraps of paper. Necessity obliges me to use them, having no other fit to write on." So this is a guy who's running a war, and he's writing on scraps of paper that he's used, because that's all he's got, because paper was incredibly expensive to get your hands on. I actually did some calculations with an old manual from Pennsylvania in the 18th century, and I figured out that if their paper mills were cranking full out, the annual output was about 2 sheets of paper per person every 2 weeks. So that's basically what you had to work with, okay? Pens had the same problem. Pens were hard to get a hold of, and they didn't work very well. Up until the early 20th century, your pen was sort of a nib pen that you dipped in an inkwell, and it was metal. And when you wrote on it, it basically ripped the cheap, crappy paper half the time and splotched all over the place, and it was incredibly slow and painful to write with these things. In fact, it wasn't until 1945 that they invented the ballpoint pen, and when it came out, it cost in equivalent dollars $90 per pen. But business people scooped them up. It was the iPad of 1945. And why did they do that? They did that because suddenly you could write much more swiftly and quickly. Your writing could keep up with the pace of your thought. And so as writing went from being something that was incredibly expensive to something cheap, we started doing new things with it. When a technology is a broadcast technology, you only have a few things you do with it. You do books, you do big ideas, you do Bibles. It's a one-to-many. But once you have a technology that is much more fluent in allowing you to set down your ideas in a cheap way, you get strange things. You get the Post-it note, which Socrates would have been completely baffled by. He had no idea that we were going to evolve a form of writing that would be ephemeral, that would be a short-term memory buffer. I'm just getting this out, putting it down, so I can arrange my thoughts by having 700 Post-it notes on the wall and stare at them maybe for a day or for a month or for a year. This is what happens as a medium goes from being a broadcast technology to something that we use to talk not to other people, but to talk to ourselves, right? So this is sort of a little tour of how text took 3 to 5,000 years to go from being a broadcast technology to something we use intimately with ourselves.